permissions required in research, actually trying to understand or run through a very gamut of permissions that may be required can be daunting. As Dr. Vanathy mentioned, I learned a lot of these when I actually became part of the ethics committee at AIIMS and realized there are a lot of rules and regulations that are related to research. So first, of course, whenever you are looking for permissions, in fact, whenever you are doing research, the key questions that you need to ask for and accordingly design your protocol, design your applications, design your form would be: what is the purpose of your research? What is the population under study which you are going to work on, and the place where you're going to do this research. So these key questions are going to, or answers to these key questions are going to actually govern the permissions required, your protocol, and all those related things. So these are just nowhere near exhaustive list of permissions that are required for research. There are a lot more, and they may be specific to the kind of research you are doing. But more or less, most of the research that we do or I have been involved in, these are the permissions that I have had to take or we would have to require to take. So the first one is the Drug Controller General of India, and the DCGI is the omnibusman for any drugs and devices that are going to be researched or marketed by any entity in the country. So that would include individuals, that would include pharma companies, that would include any startup that is designing a new device that would have whether diagnostic, interventional, or any therapeutic purpose. So the first and the most important group is the DCGI, the CDSCO. It's the CDSCO is the name of that the building and the place and the website, which is the licensing authority. Wherever you are going to do your research, like I mentioned, site or a place is important. So site permissions are important from depends upon your institution, your school. So if you're doing it in a school or a academic institution, like a lot of us are involved in school screening, besides the permission from the principal, you may have to go to the Directorate of Education or the DM of that place, because these are permissions required for doing a school survey. For the use of an instrument, so suppose you're using a screening tool, you're using a questionnaire, many of these tools are copyrighted, many of these tools may not be free to use. So when you are planning a study, you need, many of these tools are available on the net, but may not be, in a sense, free to use. You may have to ask permission. You usually should ask permission. I'll run through each one of them and maybe come out in detail. The Clinical Trial Registry of India registration, it's very, very important, because otherwise, I mean, you can proceed with your research anyway how, but the moment you submit it to Vanathy for publication, she'll ask you for a CTRI if it is a clinical trial. For international funding, if you are going to get funds from abroad, then you have a Health Ministry Screening Committee, or HMSC, which is the omnibusman for any financial transactions you are going to do from an international entity whenever funds are coming from abroad. Of course, if you have a drug trial or if you have a device that is going to be imported from abroad, you may require an import license or a trade license, after which you will be only allowed to bring it from the customs. And of course, ethics committee, as Vanathy mentioned, is probably the single most, whether you're doing it in humans, animals, stem cells. So these are the gross permissions that are required. There is, I haven't personally, and I'm not sure how many, but if you are doing research in recombinant DNA technology, genetically modified organisms, products, then there is a whole lot of these genetic targeted committees that you may have to go to get permissions to handle genetically modified products. I'll run through the DCGI permission, because that is the first and the most important and can be very challenging. So whenever there is any foreign funded trial, so if you are part of a an international multi-centric clinical trial, a DCGI permission, of course, it's not your responsibility, it is the responsibility of the sponsorer or of the group. They may have hired a CRO to kind of help them in the research in India. They are the ones who are going to approach the DCGI and get their license to do their research. Any new drug, so if there is a research going on any new drug, so a new drug will be defined by that has never been used in the country or is not approved by the CDSCO. A new fixed dose combination, so if you are now mixing up a couple of drugs that are approved but the FDC is not approved, it kind of now gets a label of a new drug and may require a DCGI permission. If you are even changing indication, route of administration, dosage or dosage form. So actually all these, while we are pretty comfortable in, you know, acquiring drugs which have been designed for systemic use, for ophthalmic use by, you know, by emulsifying them and putting them in a drop or whatever, but or injectables which we are using as drops, if you are going to, or if any entity is going to take licensing for it or to market, you will require DCGI permission. DCGI permission is not required for clinical trials that are for academic purpose, and most of us are essentially doing this for academic purposes to increase the pool of knowledge. So for them, it is not essential. It may be required in certain conditions, and this is now to be decided by your ethics committee. So now suppose you go to your institutional ethics committee and it is a drug that is an injectable and you're trying it for topical use, it may be that your ethics committee may ask you to go to the DCGI to get permission for the use of this drug. As I said, although for academic trials it is not essential, but it may be required if the ethics committee has certain concerns related to that drug or its use. So this is the gross about DCGI permission. I talked about the site permission for schools, the principal, the Department of Education. If you're planning a survey in the community or in a social group, you may have to approach the state program officer, the DGHS or the Directorate of Health Services of that state or the country, or even the health secretary sometimes if it's a large survey in a state. Of course, organization, business or a group, you may have to just approach their CEO or the master of that organization. We talked about the research instrument. A lot of times we are using questionnaires like a pain score. We are using questionnaire like a quality of life questionnaire. So while a lot of these are published and are open accessible, many of them are copyrighted or owned by the publisher or occasionally the author. It would be prudent to write to the publisher and get a formal permission. Sometimes we are not sure. The next step is sometimes we are modifying this questionnaire to suit ourselves or to suit our conditions. That is regulated by something called a fair use law. So you can modify, you can use it, provided it is not for commercial purposes. So the moment there is a commercial angle to it, you need a lot more permissions, including from the owner of the copyright. So like I mentioned, it can be, we use them very nonchalantly, but please remember it's an important tool, and that a publisher may actually write to the journal where you have put that, this was a copyrighted questionnaire. I'll just run through our ethics committee format. It's not comprehensive, it is not inclusive of everything, but this will just tell you all the key things we in our ethics committee consider important, and some of them will include permissions and some of them will just include what thinking you should have. So title, investigators, co-investigators. CV is important because we need to see that the person who is doing the study is adequately qualified to do that or not. So that's why a CV is required. Else the suggestions come that if you're doing a psych analysis, and you may not as ophthalmologist be well versed in assessing these questionnaires that have a lot of psych analysis in them, or multiple domains that we may not be well versed with, the suggestion goes that please add a psychologist, please add something who may be better at interpreting these tools and improving the quality of research. Objectives, justification of the conduct of the study, again a very, very important thing. You can't just get up and do. Actually, research, ethical research you should be doing with an objective so that it actually changes outcomes or has an impact in what you're going to do. So again, in the methodology, we always look for sample size estimation, because too many patients or too few patients are both unethical and incorrect, because you're wasting a lot of human resource if you're doing a very, very large sample size. And of course, if you take a small sample size, it's actually unethical. So ethics committee permissions this is what we are looking for when you're looking at drug. DCGI I talked about. Foreign trade, I mentioned that if this is a plan for a commercially available, or or a company is planning to market it and it's going to be imported into the country, then you may require the DGFT approvals. Safety measures are very, very important. You have to actually mention whatever you're doing. So, you know, that is something. Whatever test you may be doing, you may just be doing a survey. And we often, you know, consider that, you know, a survey, I'm just looking at the quality of life of a bilaterally blind patient after a road traffic accident. But there are a lot of things that go into it. So you can't just apply a questionnaire. There's a lot of psych-related changes that are happening to that patient. So in fact, that is why we have a social scientist, we have a lay person in our ethics committee who actually goes through these questionnaires to assess that can it be traumatic for the person to go through this questionnaire as a patient or whatever, your sample patient. So again, it's important. We need to always look from the other side. So the ethics is always designed to look from this point of view. Provision for medical risk. So often in investigator-initiated trials, you do not have funds to look for medical risk, but you have to guarantee that if there is any health hazard, and of course, this is one, you have to be upfront, including in your PIS, mention any health hazard or any damage that can happen, and subsequently also mention that we will be taking care of it, or we have made provisions for taking care of whatever adverse event that may happen to the patient as a consequence of this study. Confidentiality, again, it's an extremely important thing. You have to put it in black and white, how you are going to maintain confidentiality of the patient. It is ethically grossly incorrect if anyone gets to know. Again, we sit in busy OPDs and we have a line and the subsequent patient is listening to what I'm talking to and what advice I'm getting and the diagnosis. But when you're doing research, it is just not done that anyone else should know what is the diagnosis, what is the management, and what is the outcomes of any patient who has undergone research or is a part of a research tool. Budgets, again, because we have to look at, whether you have the adequate budget for the test. The patient should not be, as far as possible, the patient should not be paying for anything that he has to do as a part of this study. Now, if you're doing an observational study of outcomes of A lens versus B lens, and the study is not deciding the type of lens that is going to be put into the patient, it is fair enough that the patient buys the lens and comes. However, if you are, say, talking about a randomized controlled trial between A lens and B lens, then it is essential that, especially if there is significant cost difference between the two lenses, it is essential that the patient should not be paying for the lens, including some exceptional or tests that you may be wanting to do. So those are important things that we need to look at. I talked about the participant information sheet and the informed consent. I'll just look at it. I mentioned about the CTRI. So now for clinical trials, it is mandatory to register on the CTRI. It is optional at the moment for any other kind of trial, whether it is a case controlled study, it's a cohort, it is an observational. It is optional at the moment. Maybe over time it may also become mandatory. But for interventional trials, especially clinical trials, it is mandatory for you to register on the CTRI. This is just a takeaway of the important things that you need to mention when you're looking at PIS and PICF. You need to talk in detail in a direct tone, so you are not, it's not a third person that you're talking, so you're communicating to the patient and telling everything that he needs to know about the study. Now, suppose it's a randomized trial with an intervention versus a control. The patient should know that there is a third, if it's a 2:1 or a 1:1, there is a third or a 50% chance that he may not undergo any treatment. So these are important things that must be mentioned. You do not know which arm he's going to fall into, but it is mandatory that the patient should be aware of the fact, and only then is he taking an informed decision to enroll in the trial. Suppose he says, no, I want the therapy, I want some therapy. It's important for you to be able to assure the patient that not giving any intervention still remains the state of standard of care, or else we are giving you standard of care, and over and above that we are adding an intervention. So these are, as I mentioned, important comprehensive information that every patient has the right to know. And of course the consent form, where it has to be in his language. Both the PIS and the PICF have to be in the language the patient is well versed in. So in Delhi we mandatorily insist in English and Hindi, and of course that the translation is adequate. That's again one thing. It's very simple nowadays. We put it to the Google Translator, but there have been major faux pas by Google when we go through both the English and the Hindi version, and you realize there are major, so obviously he's not the one who's doing research or has understanding for it, or he or it or she, Google, whatever way you want to term. But as I mentioned, the PIS and PICF is very, very important. In fact, for clinical trials, for interventional clinical trials, it's still often necessary for us to have an audio-visual consent. So if you have an interventional randomized mass clinical trial, DCGI insists that you have a video recording of your informed consent. So first you have to take an informed consent of a video recording. Then you take the informed consent and video record it, and all the processes of signing. So first the informed consent of recording him, and of course that recording has to be kept confidential. Nobody should have access to it. Often when we have done it, we have to store them in separate memory cards, and they have to be sealed with numbered labeling so that nobody can ever get to know. However, the regulatory authority can at any time want to come and see your memory chips, so it may be necessary for you to have them stored for up to 10 years. Any consent form, any data for a clinical trial. So these are very, very important things that we must be aware of. So I've just run you through, like I mentioned, this is not an exhaustive list, depending upon the kind of study you're going to do, and the kind of patients you are going to look at. We in ophthalmology often don't look at a very vulnerable population. So although we still do sometimes research in children, which is a vulnerable population, but pregnant women, children, patients with any form of mental or physical disability, of course patients who are maybe incarcerated or are considered as vulnerable group, even school children, because they are a kind of captive audience, so they are a vulnerable group, and special care must be taken for consenting, not only from the principal but also from the parents. Even if you're looking at a school survey, especially if you are thinking of, say, even doing a refraction. So any drug on the child, a very, very strong, well-worded consent form is very essential, otherwise you may just land up into legal trouble. So thank you, Vanathi, for the opportunity, and thank you everybody for listening.
Yeah. Rohit, can you join us on the podium for a while so that we'll take questions related to, I hope you don't have to run, or you have some time. Thank you. Yeah. So I'll ask you the first question, Rohit, here. There are now an increased trend of company-sponsored research here. So I think we all know that they have a new product which is coming, a new device, a new machine, and they do run it through either a single center or multi-centric studies. So what do we need to look at? Of course, it goes through an ethics proposal, and it should be a properly formulated proposal. If it's multi-centric, each of the centers will have to submit their ethics approvals. Beyond which, what do you want us to look into when we are looking at such company-sponsored trials?
Yeah, thanks, Manathi. It's a very, very important question. Thankfully, a lot of research is going on in India now, and it's great that with new regulations and new standard regulations, the international companies are becoming more confident to keep India part of the original research team as a part of in fact, it's important because, we as a group should encourage these companies whenever they're coming up with a new drug or device to include India in their original research group whenever they're planning a multicentric trial, because in India the regulation is that a percentage of Indian patients must be have tested before it is permitted or given permissions for marketing. So any new drug that comes, unless there are very clear conditions which can allow a phase 3 clinical trial waiver for the drug, and there are certain conditions under which this waiver is given by DCGI, but otherwise every drug that is going to be introduced in the market must go through a phase 3 clinical trial in India. If required, maybe phase 1 and 2 also, depending upon the nature of the drug. So whenever you are being part of this, if you are part of any clinical trial, please see where all is this drug approved. That's the most important. Is India the only or one of a very small group of countries where this original research is going on? So if that is so, be a little more careful, because we are not aware of the complications. So if you have an idea, you ask for phase 1, phase 2 trials. Phase 1, phase 2 trials will be telling us grossly about efficacy, which is not such an important question, but about safety. All our problems in clinical trials land up because of safety, not because of efficacy. Efficacy, drug is not found good, there's no issues against you or for you. The company just loses money on a trial that did not result in a commercial product. But if there are adverse events, that results in serious issues, because as a PI, you are responsible to, within 24 hours, report the AE to the CDSCO, to your ethics committee, and to your institutional head. So that gives you a lot of responsibility. Within 24 hours, it becomes a very, very important thing. Otherwise, you're marked up for violation of a very strict rule. So look for adverse events, look for safety profile of the drug. When in doubt, get data on animal studies, get data on phase 1, phase 2 trials, so that you are fairly understanding the details of the safety. Of course, as the clinical trial will proceed, new things come up for drugs. So that is the most important thing. And 3 mandatory things for any trial: that you should have a DCGI approval, you should have an insurance certificate. That is a must, because that is saving you rather than anything else. So if anything else any adverse event happens, and there is a compensation claim, that is taken care by the insurance certificate. And third, of course, the CTRI, with your site being listed in the CTRI.
I think that has made it quite clear to us, Rohit. Then the other aspect which you yourself pointed out as an example. For example, I'm doing an RCT of comparing one drug which is already a standard of care or is being used by multiple people. We all do cataract surgeries here. And there is a new drug, a new IOL, which is, for example, being introduced, be it maybe for cataract or maybe refractive surgeries like a phakic IOL. And when you are doing a planned RCT trial, and if the company is going to say, because as government institutions we cannot fund a lot of, and there is no project in which has only a pure service component, unless and until there is a basic science or a translational research component, we do not get funding on this. So sometimes the companies are willing to provide it to us free of cost. So how does this how is this viewed in the eyes of ethics clearance?
So like I mentioned, there is nothing unethical about evaluating or even re-evaluating already marketed product. So if you have a marketed product and the company is willing to sponsor, then there is nothing ethically grossly incorrect. Obviously, sometimes we do look into the aspects of it. Yeah, so there are issues related to conflict of interest, and you're looking into as to, if it's a very well-known product, why is it being done? So the question again comes to the justification of the study. So they have to give a justification of the study, that maybe we are doing it in a different group, we are trying it in children, or there is inadequate information, it is a recently introduced lens, so there is inadequate. So that's justification is something that is important. And as I mentioned, if it's a sponsored trial, then we actually insist that the things that are going to be used for the trial should be provided free to the patient, and the patient should not be made. So it should not be that through you the company is actually increasing its sales of a particular kind of IL. So that becomes a serious ethical issue.
So I think yes. can the hall coordinator please hand over the microphones to the audience who are going? The entire audience here are our panel, so.
So very nicely elicited. Sir, I just wanted to know your views. In an interventional study, if the patients are knowing the benefit and they are going to drift from the control to the interventional group, will it not have a bearing on the result? That is one thing. And who will at all bear the cost of the escalated price, the cost?
So I'll go to the first one first. If the patient wants to change, now of course if you're doing it as a randomized trial, then
they may not.
Obviously it could not be permitted. They'll have to be excluded from the study. So the moment there is even a slight modification, the patient may have to be excluded from the study and bear the cost. So like I mentioned, now if it's a sponsored trial, then obviously the sponsorer should bear the cost of any additional interventional cost that may be incurred during the course of the study.
So if it is unforeseen, side effects, some problems.
So that's why. So one is the insurance that is important, and essentially, if there is anything, the upfront, it is the responsibility of the sponsorer to ensure any cost related to the study, to ensure that you have access to those funds or are made available to you.
Is the hospital also liable in case the patient has a syncopal attack or some medical related problem? So will the hospital come to the rescue?
Exactly. So that's what it is essential. So as the institution that has provided you permission to, that is why I mentioned that wherever you're doing the study, the institution's permission is required.
Yes.
Because vicariously they are also responsible for the proper conduct of the study and anything that happens, because the patient is not coming to anything but the institution and to the PI as the clinician. So primary responsibility of care is with them, and obviously later on if there is any examination or whatever, and SAEs have to be very carefully monitored. If there is any monitoring, any evaluation for that, then these things are considered very, very important.
Please take the mic, sir.
Yeah. Sorry, ma'am. During this Bhopal gas tragedy, we had taken a few clinical trials in Madhya Pradesh. Even though they were not FDA approved, the drugs were not even FDA approved. And some drugs were FDA approved. But the complication and the side effect the patient suffered in the hospitals of Bhopal, you may be aware of it. Now the question remains, sir, who is at fault? The company which has given us the drug to be trialed upon the patient who has suffered that Bhopal gas tragedy, and they have not quoted the side effect which this particular drug will have. And it was very perilous on the part of the Madhya Pradesh government to see that the unwanted side effects has already cropped up of a sudden. So, sir, who should be held responsible for this type of act?
So, at that time, it was unfortunate, but there were hardly any regulations in place. And as you mentioned, unregulated drugs were permitted to come in. Therefore, it is a very, very major challenge to give a clear. Right now, as I mentioned, it would be the responsibility of the hospital and the sponsorer together for any side effects that happened, and funding should be provided by the sponsorer. But it is like I mentioned, that time there were no clear rules. I'm not aware of state-wise or central rules of that time. Now we have a very clear Drugs and Cosmetics Act that very clearly defines rules that have to be followed in any research and the responsibility of every one, including ethics committee. The ethics committee is also liable for anything that happens. So that's why I'm saying. So every step there is a responsibility and duties, and they are very clearly documented in the Drugs and Cosmetics Act.
Because a lot of statutory punishment were imparted to these people, the doctors. Few of my fraternity from my medical colleges, few very stringent punishment was imparted, which was upheld in the court, then it was relieved, they were relieved. So any type of regulatory authority do we still have on these trials?
So, like I said, now onwards, yes, very clear rules. all our quote.
Yeah, yeah, you please take your time, no problem.
Hello. Yes, Rohit, that's something which everybody asks because they come from various parts of our country. How do they set up an ethics committee which would help them in their own districts, in their own societies? How can the state societies probably address this issue? And some words or pearls and advice from you on this aspect, because this is a problem which many of them who do not have
So there are two ways you can approach. Okay, now it's on. Yeah. So there are very, very clear rules about setting up ethics committee, and they are on the SEDESCO website. Very clear rules: a 15-member, how many should be institutional, how many should be including a layperson, a social scientist, a pharmacologist, a legal advisor. So there are very, very clear rules. There is no ambiguity about setting up. Now the question is that how do we set it up? Or we are not, I'm a small practitioner or I'm a small group, and how do I access it? Or my institution does not have it and does not want to spend on, or does not have that many trials. So there are two options available. One, the government has permitted, or the SEDESCO has permitted, any ethics committee to review projects of any place within 50 kilometers of that institutional ethics committee. So if that ethics committee is willing, they can be submitted these projects and they can give your ethical reviews and permissions for ethical. Of course, these have to be registered ethics committees. There is a list of registered ethics committees on the SEDESCO website. It is, earlier it was a 3-yearly renewal of registration, now it is a 5-yearly renewal. So there are very strict rules. They require documentation, and once that you are registered, they can kind of review projects for up to 50 kilometers. There are a lot of private, what is called as independent ethics committees, which are private concerns and do the same thing. They are a group of people who are running these ethics committees, and they can review. But again, their area of influence is limited to 50 kilometers. It is set up because officially the ethics committee is also supposed to monitor, periodically evaluate the site where the research is going on, where they have given the ethics approval. Therefore this. So now it may be challenging for national societies or even state societies to have a separate ethics committee because of this 50-kilometer rule. But again, you may have to work with SEDESCO to ask for whether, because of these conditions, you may ask for a waiver to that rule and be permitted to create an ethics committee.
One last question, Rohit. So, how does an individual practitioner verify the validity of such an ethics committee which exists independently? Is there a way of him knowing that his registration is expired? This is a valid committee, and do they have to pay any registration? I mean, charges for the services or charges for the ethics approval?
So, independent ethics committees obviously will be charging. So that's their business, so they're charging for this. You can check their you can ask them for their registration certificate. They all will be having a registration certificate. In fact, on their website, they're supposed to keep it because it can anytime be asked for scrutiny. And the list of all the registered ethics committees is supposed to be regularly updated on the SEDESCO website. So that's of course, the final arbitrator. But when in doubt, you can ask them that, just give me. And sometimes it is required because some journals have asked that, give us the registration certificate of the ethics committee or the registration number so that they can check it on the website.
Fantastic inputs from Dr. Rohit here. So before we move on to the next part of this IGO Live Wire, I would welcome any more questions for Dr. Rohit, please, on this subject. Yes, Tani. Take the mic, please.
In our institute, the chairman of the ethics committee is a retired judge. So is it necessary that the chairman should always be from the ethical?
No, so you have to have a legal person in the ethics committee. The chairman has to be a non-institutional member. The member secretary has to be the institutional member. The chairman has to be a non-institutional member. He can be from any background, clinician, pharmacologist, legal aspect, social scientist. So chairman can be anybody.
So, excuse me, sir. In the institution, if you want to start the research thing, so can it be the internal board and then external board?
So there is a different thing called an IRB, an institutional review board or institutional research board that does not have these regulations. So that is up to the institution how they want to compose or what rules they follow for an institutional review board or an institutional review committee. But when we are talking about an ethics committee, that is a legal committee, legally recognized by the government, by SEDISCO, the arm of the Drug and Controller General of India, and of course has, as I had mentioned, legal responsibilities. That has a very strict composition that has to be followed, before which that ethics committee will be given registration.
Thank you very much, Rohit. I think there's one more. Yeah, okay. Yes, so thanks so much, Rohit. And I think